The gavel struck the mahogany block like a gunshot. A young woman flinched, her hands trembling over the polished wood of the clerk's desk. The air in the courtroom smelled of lemon oil, stale sweat, and absolute, suffocating terror. A man was begging for his life, not from a murderer, but from a man in a black robe who was casually destroying him over a suspended license. The judge smiled, a thin, aristocratic curve of the lips, and signed the paper that would plunge the defendant into an inescapable cycle of debt and private probation. The young clerk kept her head bowed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, recording every agonizing second. She looked like a terrified, incompetent girl who was in way over her head. But appearances in Oakmont Municipal Court were a very dangerous illusion. Oakmont was a gentrifying southern city that liked to pretend it had outgrown its ugly history. Outside the courthouse, artisanal coffee shops, luxury lofts, and electric vehicle charging stations lined the sun-baked streets. Young professionals walked their expensive dogs, completely oblivious to the nightmare operating right beneath their feet. But inside the heavy oak doors of the municipal court, time had stopped. The walls were paneled in dark, oppressive mahogany that seemed to absorb the light. The air conditioning was always set to a frigid temperature, freezing the blood of the desperate people who sat on the hard, unforgiving wooden benches. This was not a place of justice. It was a processing plant. A slaughterhouse for the poor, the marginalized, and the unlucky. At the center of this fiefdom sat Judge Sterling Montgomery. He was a man of old money, inherited power, and deep institutionalized prejudice. His silver hair was always perfectly coiffed, his tailored charcoal suits barely concealed by the heavy black robes of his office. Montgomery did not just preside over the courtroom. He owned it. He treated the municipal code not as a shield for the public, but as a weapon to extract wealth from those who had none. The scheme was brilliant in its cruelty. It was a cash for misdemeanors pipeline, hidden behind a thick, impenetrable wall of dense legal jargon. A broken taillight, a noise complaint, a property blight ordinance. Minor infractions that should have resulted in a $50 fine were twisted, escalated, and weaponized. Montgomery would threaten defendants with maximum jail time, confusing them with rapid-fire legal terminology, only to offer them a merciful alternative at the very last second. Private probation, what the defendants did not know, what the city council ignored, and what the local media was too lazy to uncover, was that Montgomery had a secret, lucrative financial stake in the very private probation company he mandated. Oakmont Correctional Services was a ghost corporation, a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that ultimately funneled money directly into Montgomery's pockets. Once a signature was on that probation contract, the trap snapped shut. The victim was hit with monthly supervision fees, mandatory drug tests at $50 a pop, even for traffic violations, electronic monitoring charges, administrative surcharges. If a defendant missed a single payment, the fees doubled. If they missed two, Montgomery issued a bench warrant, throwing them in the county jail until their family could scrape together the exorbitant bail. It was a machine designed to turn human misery into untraceable dividends. Amelia Chen knew all of this. She knew the exact routing numbers of Montgomery's shell companies. She knew the names of the victims whose lives had been derailed by a single traffic stop. But right now, Amelia was busy picking up a stack of manila folders she had just dropped on the courtroom floor. She scrambled on her hands and knees, her oversized, cheap plastic glasses slipping down her nose. She wore a faded, ill-fitting beige blazer and a skirt that was slightly too long, making her look frumpy and entirely unremarkable. She let out a small, pathetic squeak of apology as a folder slid under the judge's elevated bench. Judge Montgomery looked down at her from his high leather chair. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. He let out a long, theatrical sigh that echoed through the silent, cavernous courtroom. "Miss Chen," Montgomery drawled, his voice dripping with Southern aristocratic condescension, "I was assured by the temporary staffing agency that you possessed basic motor skills. Was I misinformed?" Amelia stood up quickly, her cheeks flushed with manufactured embarrassment. She clutched the disorganized files to her chest, her shoulders hunched inward. "No, Your Honor. I am so sorry, Your Honor. The floor is just very slippery. Montgomery sneered, adjusting the cuffs of his robe. The floor is polished, Miss Chen. A concept you might be unfamiliar with. Please try to elevate yourself to the standards of this institution. Though I suppose I should lower my expectations, given the current trend of diversity hires forced upon my courtroom. Amelia swallowed hard, looking down at her scuffed, sensible shoes. Yes, Your Honor, I will do better. She played the part perfectly. To Montgomery, she was a timid, overworked junior clerk, a desperate girl who needed the meager city paycheck to survive. Someone too frightened, too uneducated, and too submissive to ever question the blatant corruption happening right in front of her face. But Amelia Chen was not a junior clerk. She was a senior special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to the elite Public Corruption Unit, and she was currently embedded by the Department of Justice to dismantle a civil rights crisis that had plagued Oakmont for over 15 years. Pinned to the lapel of her cheap blazer was a small, decorative silver flower. It looked like a piece of discount jewelry, the kind of thing you might buy at a mall kiosk. In reality, it was a state-of-the-art Department of Justice transmitter. Every cruel remark, every illegal ruling, every whispered conspiracy was being broadcast in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. A mile away, parked in a trash-strewn alley behind a defunct strip mall, was a city utility truck. The outside was painted with the faded logo of the Oakmont Water and Power Department, but inside the windowless cargo hold, it was a high-tech mobile command center. He was Amelia's handler. He listened to the audio feed, his jaw clenched so tight, his teeth ached. "Hold the line, Val." Garrett's voice murmured through the microscopic, flesh-colored earpiece buried deep in Amelia's right ear canal. "He is digging his own grave. Just let him keep talking. We need him comfortable. We need him arrogant." The heavy side doors of the courtroom swung open, and Desmond Pike walked in. Pike was the chief court administrator, but that title was a polite fiction. He was Montgomery's enabler, his attack dog, and the architect of the courthouse's impenetrable bureaucracy. Pike was a tall, skeletal man with thinning, greasy hair and a cheap suit that hung off his frame like a shroud. He carried a thick leather binder tucked under his arm. He did not look at the defendants shivering on the benches. He looked right through them, as if they were already ghosts. He was a man who worshipped rules, procedures, and paperwork, using them to crush anyone who stepped out of line. He approached the clerk's desk and dropped a stack of revised dockets in front of Amelia. The heavy thud made her jump, a reaction she carefully calculated to feed Pike's inflated ego. "Update the mainframe, Miss Chen," Pike said, his voice a flat, nasal drone that grated against the ears, "and ensure the waiver of counsel forms are pre-stamped for the afternoon session. I do not want any delays." Amelia looked at the forms. Pre-stamping a waiver of counsel was a gross violation of constitutional rights. It meant the court was legally assuming the defendants would give up their right to an attorney before they even stepped in front of the judge. It was a tactic designed to railroad uneducated defendants straight into a guilty plea. It was illegal. It was disgusting. "Mr. Pike," Amelia stammered, keeping her voice low and trembling, her eyes darting nervously toward the judge. I think these forms are supposed to be signed in the presence of the judge. After they are read their rights. The manual says." Pike leaned over the desk. He smelled of stale black coffee and peppermint mouthwash. His pale, watery eyes locked onto hers. Cold and dead. "Miss Chen," Pike whispered softly, the malice evident in every syllable. "Your job is to type. Your job is to stamp. Your job is not to think. If you find the intellectual burden of this position too taxing, I can have your final paycheck printed right now, and I will personally ensure you never find clerical work in this county again. Do we understand each other?" Amelia shrank back into her chair, her shoulders hunching even further. "I understand, Mr. Pike. I am sorry. I will stamp them right away." "See that you do," Pike sneered, turning on his heel and walking up the carpeted steps to the judge's bench. He leaned in close to Montgomery, whispering something in the judge's ear. Montgomery chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, and nodded in agreement. Amelia began stamping the forms. Thump, thump, thump. Each strike of the heavy rubber stamp felt like a hammer blow to the Constitution she had sworn to protect. She focused on her breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She had to maintain the cover. The Department of Justice needed an airtight case. They needed Montgomery on tape, explicitly tying himself to the financial extortion. They needed proof that he was intentionally altering official records. Until then, she had to play the victim. She had to swallow her pride and let the monsters think they were winning. The morning session was a masterclass in psychological torture. Montgomery did not just sentence people. He humiliated them. He stripped them of their dignity before he stripped them of their money. He used complex legal phrasing to confuse defendants who barely spoke English or who had never finished high school. When they asked for clarification, he held them in contempt of court, and he made sure Amelia was a part of it. He used her as a prop in his theater of cruelty, constantly reminding the courtroom of his absolute authority over his staff. "Miss Chen," Montgomery barked, interrupting a frantic public defender who was trying to explain that his client could not afford a $200 fine for a broken windshield. "Fetch me my coffee, the dark roast, and if it is lukewarm like yesterday, you will be drinking it from the floor." Amelia stood up, her face burning as the entire courtroom turned to stare at her. She scurried out the side door to the staff break room. She poured the coffee, her hands shaking with suppressed rage. She wanted to reach to the small of her back, draw her concealed service weapon, and end the charade. She wanted to kick the heavy oak doors open, flash her gold badge, and watch the color drain from Montgomery's arrogant, privileged face. "Easy, Val." Garrett's voice crackled in her ear, a steady, grounding presence. "I know what you are thinking. Do not do it. We need the paper trail. We need the direct link to the probation company. Bring him the coffee. Play the game." Amelia took a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkles out of her cheap blazer. She walked back into the courtroom, carefully balancing the porcelain cup on a silver saucer. As she approached the elevated bench, Pike stepped into her path, intentionally bumping her elbow with his leather binder. The hot coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the polished mahogany of the judge's platform and splashing onto Amelia's shoes. Montgomery stopped speaking mid-sentence. The public defender fell silent. The courtroom fell dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. The judge slowly turned his head, staring at the brown puddle seeping into the expensive wood. "Look at what you have done," Montgomery whispered. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. It was the voice of a man who could destroy a life with a single signature. "You clumsy, incompetent little girl." "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," Amelia gasped, dropping to her knees on the hard floor. She pulled a handful of cheap paper towels from her pocket and began frantically wiping the floor. "Mr. Pike bumped into me. I did not mean to. Do not blame Mr. Pike for your own glaring inadequacies," Montgomery snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Clean it up, every drop, and then you will stay through your lunch hour to reorganize the filing cabinets in the basement. Perhaps manual labor is more suited to your specific demographic." Amelia kept her head down, scrubbing the floor until her knuckles ached. The racial coding in his words was not subtle. It was designed to demean, to put her in her place, to remind her that she was nothing in his world. She let a single tear fall, ensuring Montgomery saw it glisten on her cheek. It fed his superiority complex. It made him feel invincible, and an invincible man is a careless man. Just before the lunch recess, Montgomery called the final case of the morning docket. An elderly Hispanic woman named Maria stood before the bench. She was trembling, clutching a worn leather purse to her chest as if it were a shield. She had been cited for having an overgrown lawn and a rusted car in her driveway, a municipal code violation that carried a maximum fine of $75. Maria spoke broken English. She tried to explain, her voice shaking with tears, that her husband had recently passed away. She explained that she could not afford a landscaper, that she was trying to clear the yard herself, but her arthritis made it difficult. Montgomery leaned back in his high leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked down at her with utter disgust, as if she were an insect that had crawled into his pristine courtroom. "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, madam," Montgomery said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the back rows where the other defendants waited. "This city has standards. We will not allow our historic neighborhoods to degenerate into slums because of your sheer laziness." Maria flinched as if she had been physically struck. "Please, Judge, I have no money. I pay next month? My daughter, she send money next month." "The court does not offer layaway," Montgomery replied coldly, adjusting his glasses. "The fine is $75. However, due to your blatant disregard for city ordinances and your failure to rectify the blight, I am adding a $200 court assessment fee. And since you cannot pay today, I find you in contempt." Amelia's fingers froze over her keyboard. A court assessment fee for a zoning violation was entirely fabricated. It did not exist in the municipal code. It was illegal. "I am sentencing you to 14 days in the county jail," Montgomery announced, picking up his heavy wooden gavel. Maria let out a sharp, agonizing cry, her knees buckling. A burly bailiff stepped forward, grabbing her arm roughly to keep her upright. "No, please. My grandchildren, they come home from school today. Nobody is there. Please, I cannot go to jail." Montgomery paused, letting the terror sink in. He let her dangle over the edge of the abyss, watching her panic. Then, with the practiced ease of a predator, he offered the rope. "There is an alternative," Montgomery said smoothly, his tone shifting to one of false benevolence. "I will suspend the jail sentence, provided you agree to 6 months of supervised probation. You will report to Oakmont Correctional Services once a week. You will pay a monthly supervision fee of $150. You will submit to random drug testing at your own expense. If you miss a payment, if you fail a test, you go straight to a cell. Do you understand?" It was extortion. Pure, unadulterated extortion. He was forcing an elderly, grieving woman to pay over $1,000 to a private company over a $75 fine, using the threat of jail and abandoned grandchildren as leverage. Maria nodded frantically, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, completely unaware that she had just signed her life away. Yes, I sign. Please, no jail. I do whatever you say." "Miss Chen," Montgomery barked, not even looking at Amelia, "print the probation mandate. Have her sign it, and get her out of my sight." Amelia typed the command into her terminal. The laser printer whirred to life, spitting out the predatory, multi-page contract. She stood up and handed the paper to Maria. As the elderly woman took the pen, her hand shaking violently, Amelia gently placed her own hand over Maria's. For a fraction of a second, Amelia dropped the timid clerk persona. She looked deep into Maria's terrified, tear-filled eyes. Amelia's gaze was steady, fierce, and filled with a silent, burning promise. "I will destroy him for this." Maria blinked, confused by the sudden, overwhelming strength in the young clerk's grip. Then Amelia let go, her shoulders slumping back into the posture of a frightened subordinate. Maria signed the paper. The trap was set. Another life fed into the machine. The courtroom finally emptied for the lunch recess. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, the sound echoing like a vault locking. It left only Amelia, Pike, and Judge Montgomery in the cavernous room. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning vents and the distant muffled sounds of traffic outside. Montgomery stood up, stretching his arms wide. He walked down from the elevated bench, his black robes billowing behind him. He approached the clerk's desk, where Amelia was quietly organizing the morning files, her head kept low. Pike stood a few feet away, holding a fresh stack of thick manila folders. "A highly productive morning, Desmond," Montgomery said, pouring himself a glass of iced water from a silver pitcher on the evidence table. "The revenue stream from the probation fees is looking exceptionally healthy this quarter. The offshore accounts should see a significant bump by Friday." "Indeed, Your Honor," Pike replied, his nasal voice devoid of any human emotion. The new municipal blight ordinances have provided a steady influx of viable candidates. The poorer neighborhoods are proving to be quite lucrative. Amelia kept her eyes glued to her computer screen, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. They were talking about it openly. The lapel pin was capturing every single word. It was good, but it was not enough. She needed Montgomery to explicitly tie himself to the financial kickbacks on record. She needed him to admit he was altering the transcripts to cover his tracks. Montgomery set his glass down and walked over to Pike. He took the stack of folders and began flipping through the afternoon docket. His eyes scanned the names, the addresses, the minor charges. Suddenly, Montgomery's finger stopped. He tapped the thick paper of a specific file. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, reaching his cold eyes. He looked at the demographic data. He looked at the neighborhood. He looked at the charge. A minor property violation. A broken fence that violated a newly passed aesthetic zoning law. Well, well, Montgomery murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Look at this one. A young single father, employed, but barely scraping by, desperate to keep custody of his child. These are the ones who never fight back. They are too terrified of losing what little they have. They will sign anything to stay out of a cell. Montgomery pulled the file from the stack and tossed it onto Amelia's desk. It landed with a heavy, ominous slap. The name on the tab read, Washington Caleb. Amelia stared at the name. She could feel the cold dread pooling in her stomach. She knew exactly what Montgomery was planning. He was going to take a young father, a man trying to build a life, and crush him under the heavy wheels of the probation machine. Montgomery leaned over the desk, invading Amelia's personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale mints. His icy eyes locked onto her oversized glasses, searching for any sign of defiance. He found none. He reached into the inner pocket of his robe and pulled out a thick stack of blank probation mandates, already stamped with the official seal of Oakmont Correctional Services. He dropped them next to Caleb Washington's file. Miss Chen, Montgomery said softly, his voice dripping with malicious anticipation. Skip your lunch break. I want you to prepare the special paperwork. Pre-stamp the waiver of counsel. Pre-fill the maximum financial penalties. Amelia looked up at him, forcing her hands to tremble against the keyboard. The special paperwork, Your Honor? Montgomery smiled. A terrifying, aristocratic display of teeth. He tapped his manicured fingernail against the blank probation contracts. Yes, Miss Chen, Montgomery whispered. Make sure everything is ready. We have a live one coming in. He straightened his heavy black robe, turning his back on her as he glided toward his private chambers to wait for the afternoon session. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving Amelia alone in the cavernous, freezing courtroom with Chief Administrator Desmond Pike. The silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning vents. Pike lingered by the clerk's desk, his skeletal frame casting a long, distorted shadow across the polished mahogany floor. He tapped his leather binder against his leg, watching Amelia with dead, watery eyes. Make sure the ink is dark, Miss Chen, Pike droned, his nasal voice grating against the quiet room. The private auditors prefer a clean stamp on the waiver forms. We would not want any bureaucratic hiccups when the accounts are reconciled at the end of the month. Amelia kept her head bowed. She reached for the heavy rubber stamp. It felt like a block of lead in her hand. She pressed it into the black ink pad, then brought it down hard on the waiver of counsel form. Thump! The sound echoed off the high ceilings. She was legally declaring that Caleb Washington had refused an attorney before he had even stepped foot inside the building. It was a blatant, undeniable deprivation of civil rights. It was a federal crime, committed in broad daylight under the protective seal of the municipal court. In her right ear, the microscopic earpiece crackled with a burst of static, followed by the low, steady voice of Agent Garrett Harris. I see the biometric spike, Val, Garrett murmured from the mobile command center, parked in the alleyway a mile away. Your heart rate is climbing. Keep it together. We need him to execute this trap on the record. We need the audio of him forcing the signature and ordering the falsification. Do not break cover." Amelia took a slow, deep breath, letting the frigid air fill her lungs. She adjusted the cheap, decorative silver flower pinned to her blazer. The state-of-the-art Department of Justice transmitter was capturing every rustle of paper, every footstep, every whispered conspiracy. "I am fine," Amelia whispered, her lips barely moving as she pretended to read the computer monitor. But the anger was a living, breathing thing inside her chest, clawing at her ribs. She was a senior special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She had spent her career dismantling corrupt institutions. But there was something uniquely vile about Oakmont Municipal Court. They did not just steal money here, they stole futures. They used the dense, impenetrable language of the law to strip the working class of their dignity and their freedom. The clock on the mahogany wall ticked forward. At exactly 1 o'clock, the heavy side doors of the courtroom were unlocked by a bored-looking bailiff. The afternoon docket trickled in. They were mostly young, mostly minorities, and entirely terrified. They took their seats on the hard wooden benches, speaking in hushed, anxious whispers. The air quickly grew thick with the smell of nervous sweat, cheap laundry detergent, and impending doom. Among them was Caleb Washington. Amelia watched him walk down the center aisle. He was 20 years old, but the deep exhaustion etched into his face made him look much older. He wore a faded blue work shirt with the logo of a local auto repair shop stitched over the breast pocket. His hands were heavily calloused and stained with motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. In his left hand, he clutched a crumpled yellow citation ticket. In his right hand, he held a small, brightly colored plastic toy. It looked like a purple hippopotamus. He kept turning the toy over and over in his fingers, a nervous tic that betrayed his mounting panic. He was a father, holding on to a piece of his child for strength in a room designed to break him. The heavy door to the judge's chambers swung open. "All rise," Desmond Pike announced, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. "The Honorable Judge Sterling Montgomery presiding." Montgomery ascended the carpeted steps to his elevated platform. He did not look at the people in the gallery. He looked over them, as if they were an unpleasant stain on his pristine courtroom. He sat down in his high-backed leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt beneath his robes, and gave a curt nod to Pike. "Call the first case," Montgomery ordered, his voice echoing off the dark wood paneling. Pike adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down at his clipboard. Docket number 482-9. City of Oakmont versus Caleb Washington. Caleb stood up. He took a deep breath, slipped the plastic toy into his pocket, and walked toward the podium. His heavy work boots squeaked softly against the polished floor. He stopped at the wooden stand, surrounded by the suffocating weight of the mahogany room. He looked up at the judge with a mixture of respect and raw fear. "Mr. Washington," Montgomery began, not bothering to look up from the file in front of him. "You are before this court on a citation for violating Municipal Property Blight Ordinance Section 402. Specifically, a collapsed perimeter fence on your residential property. How do you plead?" Caleb cleared his throat. His voice was deep, but it trembled slightly. "Your Honor, I am not trying to cause any trouble. The storm last month blew down 2 panels of the fence. I work double shifts at the garage, and I just have not had the daylight to fix it. But I bought the wood yesterday. I have the receipt right here in my pocket. If you just give me until Sunday, I will have it completely rebuilt." Montgomery slowly raised his head. His eyes locked onto Caleb, cold and unblinking. "I did not ask for a weather report, Mr. Washington. Nor did I ask for your work schedule. I asked for your plea. Under Section 402, subsection C, the burden of aesthetic maintenance falls entirely on the property owner, regardless of weather events. Are you familiar with the doctrine of strict liability?" Caleb blinked, confused by the dense legal terminology. I am just saying I am going to fix it, sir. I am a single dad. My little girl stays with my mom while I work. I am just trying to keep the house looking nice. I just need a few days. This courtroom is not a charity, and I am not your landlord," Montgomery snapped, his voice rising in volume, designed to intimidate the entire room. "You are in violation of the law. You are degrading the aesthetic value of a historic neighborhood. I find you guilty of the ordinance violation." Caleb gripped the edges of the podium. "Okay. I understand. I will pay the ticket." The paper said it was a $50 fine. Montgomery leaned forward, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. The statutory base fine is $50. However, due to your failure to rectify the blight in a timely manner, I am assessing a $300 court administrative surcharge. Furthermore, I am applying a $150 technology fee and a $200 community aesthetic degradation penalty. The total is $700, payable immediately to the clerk. The color drained from Caleb's face. $700? Your Honor, I do not have $700. I have $80 in my checking account until Friday. If I give you that, I cannot buy groceries for my daughter. Please, can I get on a payment plan? Or can I get a public defender? I cannot afford a lawyer, and I do not understand these fees." The courtroom went dead silent. Asking for a public defender was a constitutional right. It was the absolute baseline of the American judicial system, but in Oakmont Municipal Court, it was treated as an insult to the crown. Montgomery's face hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. "A public defender?" he mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You want the hard-working taxpayers of this city to fund a legal defense for your own laziness? Request denied. This is a municipal infraction, not a felony trial. You have no right to appointed counsel here." It was a lie. A blatant, terrifying lie spoken with absolute authority. Amelia felt her fingernails bite into the palms of her hands. She kept her eyes glued to her monitor, recording the deprivation of rights in real time. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He let the silence stretch, allowing the terror to fully consume the young father standing before him. "You know, Mr. Washington," Montgomery said softly, his tone shifting to a dangerous conversational whisper, "a man who cannot maintain his own property, who cannot pay his lawful debts to this city, is hardly in a position to provide a stable environment for a child." Caleb froze. His eyes went wide. "What?" Montgomery continued, his voice smooth as glass. "As a judge, I am a mandatory reporter. Child Protective Services takes a very dim view of such financial and domestic instability. It would be a profound tragedy if they had to open an investigation into your home life and perhaps place your daughter in foster care simply because you refuse to take responsibility for your actions. It was extortion. Pure, unadulterated psychological extortion. Montgomery was using his position to weaponize the state against Caleb's family. He was threatening to steal a child over a broken fence. "I am remanding you to the county jail for 90 days for failure to pay court-ordered fines," Montgomery announced, picking up his heavy wooden gavel. "No," Caleb shouted, stepping back from the podium, his voice cracking with panic. "You cannot do that. Who is going to watch my little girl? I will lose my job. Please." Two burly bailiffs immediately stepped forward, their hands resting on the heavy leather belts that held their handcuffs and pepper spray. They flanked Caleb, boxing him in, their physical presence a heavy threat of violence. Montgomery held up a single hand, pausing the bailiffs. "However," Montgomery said, his voice echoing in the tense room, "I am a merciful judge. I will suspend the 90-day jail sentence, provided you agree to immediate enrollment in a private probation program." Montgomery gestured toward Amelia's desk. "Miss Chen has the paperwork. You will sign a contract with Oakmont Correctional Services. You will pay a monthly supervision fee of $200. You will submit to random drug testing at $50 a test. You will report in person every Tuesday. If you miss a single payment or a single meeting, the suspended sentence activates, and you will spend the next 3 months in a concrete cell. Do you understand?" Caleb looked at the bailiffs. He looked at the judge. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom, knowing he could never run fast enough to escape. He was trapped. The system had closed its jaws around him, and there was no way out. The debt trap would consume his paycheck, force him into default, and eventually land him in a cell anyway. But right now, it was the only way to go home to his daughter. Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Okay," he whispered, his voice completely broken. "Okay, I will sign it. Just do not take me to jail." "Excellent," Montgomery said, a sickening smile returning to his face. He picked up the official court docket, a heavy piece of cardstock that served as the permanent legal record of the hearing. He leaned over the elevated bench and handed it down to Amelia. "Miss Chen," Montgomery ordered, his voice crisp and authoritative, "update the mainframe immediately. Let the official record reflect that the defendant became belligerent and uncooperative in my courtroom." Amelia took the heavy paper. Her hands were shaking, but this time it was not an act. It was pure, unadulterated rage. "And Miss Chen," Montgomery added, his icy eyes locking onto hers, "ensure the transcript explicitly states that Mr. Washington voluntarily waived his right to counsel and that he eagerly accepted the probation terms to avoid a justified contempt charge. Type it exactly as I said it." Amelia sat at her terminal. The screen was bright white, the blinking black cursor mocking her. It was waiting for her to type the lie. It was waiting for her to forge a federal document, to permanently alter a legal transcript, and to seal the destruction of the young father standing just a few feet away. In her ear, Garrett's voice was urgent. "We have it, Val. We have the order to falsify records. That is the final nail in his coffin. Type the lie. Maintain the cover. We will fix Caleb's record later. Just type it." Amelia looked at the keyboard. She looked at the blinking cursor. Then she slowly turned her head. She looked at Caleb Washington. The bailiffs had already grabbed his arms, treating him like a violent criminal rather than a terrified father. Caleb's head was bowed, his spirit completely crushed under the weight of the mahogany room. He was clutching the plastic purple hippopotamus in his pocket as if it were a lifeline. Amelia looked back up at Judge Sterling Montgomery. He was already looking past her, bored, waiting for the next victim to be called to the podium. He was so secure in his power, so insulated by his wealth and his prejudice, that he did not even consider the possibility of resistance from a lowly clerk. Amelia felt the timid, frightened persona dissolve. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom seemed to shatter around her. She was done playing the victim. She was done watching the slaughter. The Department of Justice had their evidence, but Amelia Chen had her limit. Amelia took her hands off the keyboard. She sat up straight, her spine aligning into a posture of absolute, unyielding authority. She looked directly into Montgomery's cold, arrogant eyes. "No, Your Honor," Amelia said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent courtroom with the force of a physical blow. It was firm, steady, and completely devoid of fear. "I won't type that." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a devastating impact. Caleb Washington stopped struggling against the bailiffs, turning his head to stare at the small, frumpy clerk who had just committed professional suicide. Desmond Pike dropped his pen, the plastic clattering loudly against the wooden table. Judge Sterling Montgomery did not blink. The aristocratic sneer melted off his face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. He leaned over the elevated bench, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the mahogany railing. "Excuse me?" Montgomery whispered. The sound was like a razor blade scraping across glass. "I will not falsify a federal document," Amelia replied, her voice unwavering. Mr. Washington did not waive his right to counsel. He explicitly asked for a public defender. Montgomery stared at her. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. He was a predator, and predators recognize when prey suddenly stops acting like prey. But his arrogance quickly smothered his doubt. He was a king in his castle. She was a peasant. "Court is adjourned," Montgomery barked, slamming his gavel down so hard the wood splintered. "Bailiffs, process the defendant. Mr. Pike, clear the gallery. Miss Chen, you are coming with me right now." The bailiffs dragged Caleb through the heavy side doors. Caleb looked back at Amelia, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Then the doors clicked shut, and he was gone. The gallery was quickly cleared, the heavy oak doors locked with a resounding click. Amelia stood at the clerk's desk. In her right ear, the microscopic earpiece crackled. "Val," Garrett said, his voice tight with tension. "You broke protocol. You challenged him on the record." "I had to, Garrett," Amelia murmured, her lips barely moving. "He was going to destroy that man right in front of me. I have the audio of the order to falsify. We have enough." "We do," Garrett replied. "But Montgomery knows you are a liability now. Men like him do not leave loose ends. Be ready. I have tactical teams standing by 3 blocks away." Before Amelia could respond, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around. Desmond Pike stood towering over her. In the dim emergency lighting of the empty courtroom, his skeletal face looked like a skull. He smelled of stale coffee and cold sweat. His grip on her shoulder was painfully tight, his long fingers digging into her collarbone. "The judge will see you now, Miss Chen," Pike droned. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. Amelia allowed her shoulders to slump. She let the fear creep back into her eyes, resuming the role of the terrified junior clerk. "I was just leaving, Mr. Pike. Can it wait until tomorrow?" Pike did not answer. He simply tightened his grip and physically hauled her out of her chair. He marched her across the dark courtroom, up the carpeted steps, and toward the heavy, reinforced oak door of the judge's private chambers. The walk felt like a march to an execution. The portraits of past judges stared down at them from the mahogany walls, their painted eyes cold and indifferent. This was the hidden architecture of corruption. The soundproofed doors, the private corridors, the spaces where the law was twisted and broken away from the public eye. Amelia cataloged every detail, every locked door, every camera angle. Pike pushed the heavy oak door open and shoved her inside. The chamber was a monument to old money and unchecked power. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes that looked like they had never been opened. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cigar smoke and aged bourbon. The walls were heavily soundproofed. Once the door clicked shut behind her, the silence was absolute. Judge Montgomery sat behind the desk, swirling a crystal glass of amber liquid. He did not look angry anymore. He looked deeply, terrifyingly calm. "Sit down, Miss Chen," Montgomery commanded, gesturing to a stiff leather chair opposite his desk. Amelia sat, keeping her hands clasped tightly in her lap to simulate trembling. Pike stood directly behind her, blocking the only exit. Montgomery took a slow sip of his bourbon. "You disappointed me today, Amelia. I gave you an opportunity to be a part of a highly efficient, highly profitable system. All you had to do was keep your head down and type. But you chose to be a disruption. And I do not tolerate disruptions in my courthouse." He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the polished wood. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud. "Do you know what this is?" Montgomery asked softly. Amelia shook her head, her eyes wide behind her oversized glasses. "This is $10,000 in cash," Montgomery said, leaning forward. "It is the missing bail funds from last week's night court session. The funds that mysteriously vanished from the clerk's safe." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. "I do not know anything about that, Your Honor. I do not even have the combination to the safe." Montgomery smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips. "That is irrelevant, because Mr. Pike here just conducted a random search of your locked desk drawer, and miraculously, he found this envelope tucked beneath your spare cardigan." Amelia stared at the envelope. It was a frame job, a meticulously planned, flawlessly executed trap. They were not just going to fire her, they were going to destroy her. "You are planting evidence," Amelia whispered, letting her voice crack with manufactured panic. "You cannot do this. The security camera in the hallway will prove Mr. Pike went into my desk. "Oh, I can do whatever I please, Miss Chen." Montgomery laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He stood up and walked over to a small security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He reached up and casually yanked the power cord from the wall. "The hallway camera has been malfunctioning all week," he added smoothly. "There," Montgomery said, turning back to face her. "Now it is just us. No cameras, no official record. Just the word of a highly respected municipal judge and his chief administrator against a clumsy, insubordinate diversity hire. Who do you think the police will believe?" He walked slowly around the desk, his black robes trailing behind him like a shadow. He stopped right next to Amelia's chair, looking down at her with absolute disgust. "I have spent 15 years building this system," Montgomery boasted, his voice dripping with arrogance. 15 years turning the dregs of this city into a highly lucrative revenue stream. Do you think I care about people like Caleb Washington? They are cattle. They exist to be milked. They break the aesthetic laws of my city, and they pay for it. The private probation fees, the mandatory drug tests, the administrative surcharges. It all flows back to me. Amelia kept her head down, letting the lapel pin capture every single word. He was confessing to all of it, completely blinded by his own hubris. "And you," Montgomery sneered, leaning in close. "You thought you could play the hero. You thought you could invoke the Constitution in my courtroom. The Constitution does not apply here, Miss Chen. I apply here." He reached onto his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper and a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. He slid them across the mahogany surface until they rested right in front of Amelia. "This is a typed confession," Montgomery explained smoothly. "It states that you embezzled the $10,000 to pay off personal debts. You will sign it. You will tender your immediate resignation, and you will walk out of this building and never return. If you do that, I will mercifully decline to press charges." "And if I do not?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Montgomery leaned over her, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her. "If you do not," Montgomery whispered, his breath hot and smelling of bourbon, "Mr. Pike will call the police. You will be arrested for a state felony. You will be held without bail. You will go to prison, and your life will be over. And no one in Washington, no one in the media, and certainly no one in this city will care about a pathetic little clerk who tried to steal from the crown." The silence in the soundproofed chamber was suffocating. Pike shifted his weight behind her, ready to restrain her if she panicked. Montgomery stared down at her, waiting for the inevitable tears, the begging, the complete surrender. Amelia looked at the confession. She looked at the gold-plated pen. Then she stopped trembling. The frightened, hunched posture vanished entirely. Her shoulders squared. Her breathing slowed to a calm, rhythmic pace. She reached out and picked up the heavy fountain pen. Montgomery smiled, thinking he had won. "Good girl," he murmured. Amelia held the pen in both hands. With a sudden, sharp twist of her wrists, she snapped the thick metal completely in half. Ink exploded across the pristine white paper and splattered onto the polished mahogany desk. Montgomery jumped back, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell are you doing?" Amelia slowly stood up from the chair. She turned her head, looking at Montgomery. The timid, oversized glasses caught the dim light of the room. Behind them, her eyes were no longer the eyes of a terrified victim. They were the eyes of an apex predator. She smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. "I am doing my job, Sterling," Amelia said, her voice completely stripped of its previous tremor. She dropped the shattered pieces of the gold-plated pen onto the ruined confession. The black ink pooled over the fabricated words, soaking into the heavy paper like blood. She reached up and pulled the oversized, cheap plastic glasses from her face, tossing them onto the desk. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squaring as she seemed to grow taller in the dim light of the soundproofed chamber. The frumpy, terrified junior clerk vanished, replaced by a woman who radiated absolute, lethal authority. "What you just attempted," Amelia continued, her tone conversational but sharp as a scalpel, "is a textbook violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1951. The Hobbs Act. Extortion, under color of official right. Montgomery stared at her, his mouth slightly open. The bourbon glass in his hand trembled, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. He looked at Pike, then back at Amelia, his aristocratic brain struggling to process the sudden, violent shift in reality. Add to that, Amelia said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him, Title 18, Section 1346, Honest Services Fraud. You have been using the United States mail and wire systems to funnel illicit probation fees into offshore shell companies. And let us not forget the crown jewel. Section 241. Conspiracy against rights. You and Mr. Pike have systematically deprived the citizens of Oakmont of their constitutional right to counsel. You are insane, Montgomery spat, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He slammed his glass down on the desk. You are a hysterical, incompetent little girl who has lost her mind. Desmond, restrain her. Call the police. Tell them she attacked me. Pike stepped forward, his skeletal hands reaching out to grab her arms. Amelia did not flinch. She did not even look at Pike. She simply raised her right hand and tapped the cheap decorative silver flower pinned to the lapel of her faded blazer. I would not do that, Desmond, Amelia warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Unless you want to add assaulting a federal agent to your indictment. Pike froze. Montgomery let out a harsh, barking laugh. But it sounded hollow. A federal agent? Montgomery mocked, though a bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. You expect me to believe the FBI sent a diversity hire to audit my courthouse? You are bluffing. There are no cameras in here. There is no record. You are right about the cameras, Sterling, Amelia said, a cold smile playing on her lips. But you are wrong about the record. This lapel pin is a high-fidelity, encrypted transmitter. For the last 3 weeks, every racist remark, every illegal ruling, and every extortion demand has been broadcast in real time. And for the last 10 minutes, your entire confession has been streaming directly to the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Justice. The color completely drained from Montgomery's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. He looked at the silver flower. He looked at the ink-stained desk. The 15-year reign of terror, the untouchable fiefdom, the offshore accounts. It was all gone. Pike, however, did not freeze. The bureaucratic enabler realized his life was over. With a guttural yell, he lunged across the room, his long arms reaching for Amelia's throat, desperate to rip the transmitter from her jacket and destroy the evidence. He never made it halfway. The heavy, reinforced oak doors of the judge's private chambers did not just open. They shattered. A deafening, concussive boom shook the very foundation of the courthouse as a heavy steel battering ram struck the wood. The heavy door splintered and tore off its hinges, sent crashing to the floor by the sheer brute force of the strike. Dust filled the air, choking the room. Before the heavy wood even settled, the room was flooded with men in heavy tactical gear. FBI SWAT and United States Marshals poured through the shattered doorway, their heavy boots trampling over the ruined mahogany. Federal agents, get on the ground. Show me your hands. The commands were a wall of sound, absolute and overwhelming. Pike was tackled mid-lunge. A massive marshal slammed him into the floor, driving a knee into his spine. The cold, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the smoke. Montgomery stumbled backward, his legs giving out. He collapsed into his high-backed leather chair, his hands raised in the air. 3 red laser sights painted the center of his chest, glowing brightly against the dark fabric of his judicial robes. He was hyperventilating, his aristocratic composure shattered into a million pieces. Through the clearing smoke, Agent Garrett Harris walked into the chamber. He wore a tactical vest over a dark shirt, his face set in a grim, uncompromising line. He looked at the ink splattered across the desk, then looked at Amelia. "Are you injured, Agent Chen?" Garrett asked, his voice steady. "I am perfectly fine, Garrett," Amelia replied, smoothing the lapels of her blazer. She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out a heavy leather wallet. She flipped it open, letting the gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation catch the light. She walked slowly around the desk until she was standing directly over Judge Sterling Montgomery. He was weeping. Real, pathetic tears streamed down his wrinkled face, his chest heaving with panic. The untouchable god of Oakmont Municipal Court was nothing more than a terrified old man. "You told me the Constitution does not apply here," Amelia said, her voice echoing in the ruined chamber. "You told me that you apply here, that you were the law." She leaned down, her face inches from his. "You are not the law, Sterling," Amelia whispered, her words striking him like physical blows. "You are a parasite. You used the sacred trust of the bench to feed on the most vulnerable people in this city. You stole their money, you stole their dignity, and you tried to steal their children." "Please," Montgomery sobbed, his hands shaking violently. "Please, we can make a deal. I have money. I can cooperate." "The court does not offer layaway," Amelia replied, throwing his exact words back into his face. "Take this garbage out of my sight." Two marshals hauled Montgomery to his feet. They did not let him change. They locked the heavy federal chains around his wrists and ankles, the steel clashing loudly against the polished floor. They marched him out of his own chambers, parading him through the courthouse in his black robes, a symbol of justice finally brought to heel. The courthouse was a swarm of federal activity. Agents were seizing computers, boxing up files, and securing the clerk's safe. But Amelia had one final task. She walked down the sterile, concrete hallway to the temporary holding cells in the basement. She stopped in front of cell number 3. Caleb Washington was sitting on the metal bench, his head buried in his hands. He looked up as Amelia approached, his eyes red and swollen. He expected to see a bailiff coming to transport him to the county jail. Instead, he saw the frumpy clerk, now flanked by 2 armed federal agents. Amelia signaled to the agent, who unlocked the heavy iron door. It swung open with a loud creak. "What is happening?" Caleb asked, his voice trembling. "Did I do something else wrong?" Amelia stepped into the cell, her eyes softened, the cold predator vanishing, replaced by a deep, profound empathy. "You did nothing wrong, Mr. Washington," Amelia said gently. "The fine against you was illegal. The probation mandate was a fraud. Your record has been completely expunged. You are a free man." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, brightly colored plastic toy, the purple hippopotamus. It had fallen from his pocket when the bailiffs had dragged him away. She held it out to him. Caleb stared at the toy, then looked up at Amelia. The realization washed over him like a tidal wave. The nightmare was over. He took the toy, his calloused hands shaking, and clutched it to his chest. A single tear escaped his eye, rolling down his cheek. "I can go home?" Caleb whispered. "I can go see my little girl?" "Go home, Caleb." Amelia smiled, a real, warm smile. "She is waiting for you." An hour later, Amelia Chen walked out of the heavy oak doors of the Oakmont Municipal Court for the last time. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the gentrified streets. The flashing red and blue lights of dozens of federal vehicles illuminated the mahogany walls of the building, a beacon of retribution in the gathering dusk. She climbed into the passenger seat of the unmarked city utility truck. Garrett put the vehicle in drive, pulling away from the curb. Amelia looked out the window, watching the courthouse shrink in the rearview mirror. The fiefdom of gavel and greed had been burned to the ground. The monsters had been dragged into the light. Amelia closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engine wash over her. The shadow warrior, resting for a brief moment, before disappearing into the dark to find the next broken system waiting to be dismantled.